Germany was not weakened by incompetence. It was constrained by design. For decades, industrial strength was built on precision, scale, and uninterrupted energy flows. Factories optimized, supply chains stretched, margins narrowed, and dependency quietly deepened. The system rewarded efficiency, not resilience. When external pressures reshaped energy access, the architecture that once amplified output began to restrict motion. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow tightening. Power remained visible, yet flexibility vanished. What appears as decline is better understood as entrapment. Where industrial mastery survives inside boundaries it did not fully control. The pattern repeats before recognition arrives again. Germany's post-war economic system was engineered around a single organizing assumption. That energy would remain abundant, predictable, and externalized. Industrial competitiveness did not depend on domestic resource control, but on the ability to convert imported inputs into high-value output with extreme efficiency. This model rewarded specialization, long production cycles, and dense industrial clustering. Energy was treated not as a strategic variable, but as a stable utility embedded quietly beneath everything else. Over time, this assumption inverted. The more efficient the system became, the less tolerant it grew of disruption. Heavy industry, chemical production, automotive manufacturing, and advanced machinery all synchronized their operations around uninterrupted energy flows. Capital investment followed this logic. Infrastructure, labor training, and export capacity were optimized for continuity, not substitution. The system gained speed, but lost optionality. External structures reinforced the inversion. Energy sourcing was integrated into broader geopolitical and regulatory frameworks that prioritized cost minimization and environmental compliance over strategic redundancy. Long-term supply relationships replaced domestic buffers. Market mechanisms replaced stockpiles. Stability was no longer defended internally, it was assumed externally. This inversion remained invisible during expansion. Output grew, trade surpluses accumulated, and industrial credibility solidified. Dependency did not register as weakness because it produced no immediate penalty. In fact, it enhanced competitiveness. Energy dependence became a feature, not a flaw, as long as external conditions held. The critical shift occurred when energy ceased to behave as a neutral input and began functioning as a lever. Once access, pricing, and reliability were shaped by forces outside industrial control, the system's internal strengths could no longer compensate. Efficiency amplified exposure. Scale magnified rigidity. What once protected margins now constrained response. At that point, the system did not fail outright. It inverted. Industrial power persisted in form, but its foundation became conditional. The structure could still operate, but only within limits it did not define. This is the moment when strength transforms into fragility without changing appearance. The collapse mechanism did not originate in energy scarcity. It emerged from structural lock-in. Once Germany's industrial system committed to scale, specialization, and just-in-time energy inputs, reversal became prohibitively costly. Energy dependence was no longer a policy choice. It was embedded into capital allocation, plant design, labor organization, and export contracts. At that stage, adaptation required not adjustment, but reconstruction. Financialization intensified the mechanism. Industrial firms optimized balance sheets around predictable input costs, low volatility, and stable margins. Energy price stability was implicitly capitalized into valuations, debt structures, and long-term planning. When volatility entered the system, it did not merely raise costs. It destabilized expectations embedded in financing. Hedging instruments, supply contracts, and regulatory offsets absorbed short shocks, but not structural repricing. Risk that had been assumed absent suddenly reappeared everywhere at once. The energy market itself ceased to function as a market. Pricing detached from production logic and began reflecting geopolitical constraints, regulatory intervention, and strategic scarcity. Under these conditions, substitution was not immediate. Industrial processes calibrated for specific energy inputs could not pivot without efficiency loss, downtime, or capital write-offs. The system faced a paradox: reduce output to preserve margins, or maintain output at negative economics to preserve market position. Both choices weakened long-term viability. Labor and infrastructure amplified the rigidity. Skilled workforces were concentrated in energy-intensive sectors tied to fixed location. Time Yital 0.5's grid design favored centralized flows rather than rapid diversification. Environmental transition frameworks assumed gradual substitution under stable conditions, not abrupt constraint under pressure. As a result, policy instruments designed for transformation operated too slowly for shock absorption. They optimized the future while the present destabilized. Export dependence completed the mechanism. Germany's industrial surplus relied on global demand, sensitive to price competitiveness. As energy costs rose unevenly across regions, comparative advantage eroded. Foreign buyers did not adjust for structural constraints. They shifted suppliers. Market share loss occurred incrementally, then suddenly, as contracts rolled and alternatives matured. At no point did a single failure trigger collapse. The mechanism functioned through accumulation. Each constraint reinforced the next. Energy volatility stressed margins. Margin stress constrained investment. Investment delay reduced adaptability. Reduced adaptability magnified exposure to the next shock. The system remained operational, but increasingly brittle. This is how industrial power declines without dramatic failure. The machinery still runs. The output still exists. But the system's margin for error disappears. Collapse, in this context, is not cessation. It is loss of control over conditions of operation. Once that threshold is crossed, recovery depends not on efficiency, but on structural reconfiguration. History offers multiple blueprints for this pattern, though they rarely appear identical on the surface. In the late 19th century, the British industrial system faced a similar inversion. Britain's dominance rested on coal, shipping, and manufacturing scale. For decades, energy abundance and imperial access masked structural exposure. Industrial capital clustered tightly around existing inputs. When competitors adopted newer technologies and alternative energy mixes, Britain's advantage did not vanish instantly. It narrowed. Margins compressed. Adaptation proved slow because the system had been optimized for continuity, not transition. The empire did not collapse when coal weakened. It lost flexibility long before decline became visible. A comparable mechanism unfolded in post-war Japan. Industrial expansion relied on imported energy, transformed through extreme efficiency into manufactured exports. For years, the model delivered growth without friction. When energy pricing shifted abruptly, the system did not break immediately. Instead, profitability eroded unevenly. Firms with the highest efficiency suffered first because their margins were thinnest. Adaptation required capital reallocation, relocation, and redesign at a scale that could not be executed quickly. Japan retained industrial capacity, but its growth trajectory flattened as dependency became constraint. The pattern extends further back. The Roman economy depended not only on conquest, but on continuous inflows of grain, metals, and labor from the periphery. As expansion slowed, logistics costs rose, while administrative complexity increased. Rome did not collapse when supply failed outright. It stagnated as dependency exceeded control. The system continued to function, but only by diverting resources from maintenance to preservation. Output persisted, but resilience vanished. In each case, the critical failure was not misjudgment of risk. It was temporal mismatch. Systems optimized for long periods of stability cannot compress adaptation into short windows without incurring structural damage. Germany's case follows this logic precisely. Industrial infrastructure, labor specialization, regulatory alignment, time 0.3s, and export orientation all assumed gradual change under predictable conditions. Energy transition was modeled as linear. External constraint arrived as discontinuous. Another historical parallel emerges in the late Soviet Union. Industrial output remained substantial, even as energy extraction and allocation became increasingly inefficient. The system preserved production volumes by sacrificing quality, investment, and innovation. From the outside, capacity appeared intact. Internally, control eroded. Dependency on centralized inputs amplified fragility. When adjustment became unavoidable, the system lacked the mechanisms to execute it smoothly. These precedents reveal a consistent sequence. First, efficiency gains concentrate around a dominant input. Second, alternative pathways are deprioritized as uncompetitive. Third, dependency deepens until reversal costs exceed tolerance. Fourth, an external shift redefines the input from neutral utility to strategic constraint. Fifth, adaptation lags because the system was never designed for speed of reconfiguration. Decline manifests not as collapse, but as constrained motion. Germany's trajectory aligns with this sequence. Its industrial architecture reflects decades of rational optimization under stable assumptions. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. That design now encounters conditions it did not anticipate. History suggests that once this threshold is crossed, recovery depends less on policy intent and more on the willingness to accept structural loss in exchange for regained control. This is not a story of incompetence repeated. It is a story of patterns repeating when systems mistake stability for permanence. The pattern unfolds in stages, each reinforcing the next without requiring coordination or intent. The first stage is optimization dominance. Once a system identifies a single configuration that maximizes output under stable conditions, capital, labor, and policy converge toward it. Alternative pathways are not prohibited. They are simply rendered uncompetitive. Over time, redundancy appears inefficient. Flexibility becomes excess cost. Germany's industrial core reached this stage when energy-intensive manufacturing, export orientation, and long supply chains consistently outperformed diversified or localized models. Success validated concentration. The second stage is pathway foreclosure. As optimization deepens, switching costs rise, infrastructure hardens around the dominant input. Training pipelines specialize, regulatory frameworks adapt to protect the prevailing configuration. At this point, choice still exists in theory, but not in practice. Reconfiguration would require coordinated losses across multiple sectors simultaneously. No single actor initiates that process voluntarily. The system becomes path-dependent. Germany entered this stage as energy sourcing, grid design, and industrial geography aligned tightly around continuous external supply. The third stage is dependency normalization. What began as a strategic assumption becomes an invisible baseline. Energy access is no longer debated as a variable. Time, 0.5s. It is priced, hedged, and embedded into contracts as if permanent. Risk models exclude prolonged disruption because it has not occurred within relevant planning horizons. Institutions reward performance against the assumed baseline. Warning signals, when they appear, are interpreted as temporary deviations rather than structural indicators. This stage persisted longest because it produced no immediate cost. The fourth stage is external reclassification. An input once treated as neutral is redefined by forces beyond the system's control. Energy becomes political, constrained, or strategically rationed. Prices decouple from marginal production costs. Reliability is no longer guaranteed by market mechanisms alone. At this moment, internal efficiency ceases to compensate. The system discovers that it does not control the variable it most depends upon. Germany crossed into this stage when energy access began reflecting external alignment rather than industrial demand. The fifth stage is margin compression. Costs rise unevenly, but revenues do not adjust symmetrically. Export markets do not absorb higher prices driven by structural constraint. Firms face a narrowing band between profitability and continuity. High-efficiency producers, once advantaged, are hit hardest because their buffers are minimal. Temporary subsidies or regulatory relief delay adjustment but do not restore competitiveness. Investment decisions freeze as uncertainty replaces predictability. The sixth stage is adaptive paralysis. At this point, all available responses carry negative trade-offs. Shifting production locations erodes domestic capacity. Re-engineering processes requires time and capital that margins no longer support. Accelerating energy transition collides with infrastructure timelines. Maintaining output sacrifices profitability. Reducing output sacrifices market presence. The system oscillates without resolving the constraint. Time, 0.5s, control shifts from internal planning to external reaction. The seventh stage is silent deindustrialization. Capacity does not disappear overnight. It erodes through deferred maintenance, cancelled expansions, workforce attrition, and contract non-renewal. Output remains visible, but growth potential vanishes. Strategic sectors survive on intervention rather than advantage. The economy retains its industrial identity while losing its autonomy. Germany's system enters this phase not through collapse, but through gradual constraint tightening. The final stage is structural acceptance. The system adjusts, expectations downward. Policymakers recalibrate targets. Firms redefine success as survival rather than dominance. What was once considered temporary becomes the new normal. At this point, reversal is possible only through deliberate acceptance of loss, either in scale, specialization, or position within global chains. History shows that systems rarely choose this path early. They arrive there after options have narrowed. This sequence does not require failure of leadership or foresight. It unfolds naturally when systems prioritize efficiency under stable assumptions and underestimate the speed at which external conditions can change. Germany's trajectory follows this pattern with precision. The stages do not guarantee collapse, but they define its shape. What disappears first is not output, but control. The modern alignment of Germany's system reveals why recovery is constrained even when awareness increases. The industrial core remains embedded within a global framework that rewards coordination over autonomy. Energy markets, regulatory regimes, and supply chains are no longer national instruments. They are networked systems governed by multilateral rules, cross-border dependencies, and political signaling. This alignment reduces volatility under normal condition. Time, it's 0.3s, but it also disperses control when stress appears. Germany operates inside a lattice where influence is shared, but responsibility is localized. Energy transition policies exemplify this alignment. Decarbonization frameworks were designed to function alongside stable baseload inputs, predictable pricing corridors, and incremental substitution. They assume time. They assume coordination. They assume that industrial systems can absorb transitional inefficiencies without threatening continuity. When external constraints compress timelines, these assumptions invert. Transition mechanisms begin competing with survival mechanisms. Capital intended for transformation is redirected towards stabilization. Long-term planning yields to short-term containment. Financial alignment reinforces the constraint. Germany's industrial champions are deeply integrated into global capital markets. Investment decisions are evaluated against international benchmarks, risk models, and shareholder expectations calibrated to stable input environments. When energy volatility increases, it is not interpreted as a localized anomaly. It is priced as structural uncertainty. Financing costs rise. Expansion is delayed. Projects that depend on predictable operating margins become unviable. The system does not lack capital. It lacks confidence in the conditions required to deploy it. Trade alignment further limits adjustment. Export competitiveness depends not only on absolute efficiency, but on relative cost positioning across regions. When energy prices diverge structurally, comparative advantage shifts even if productivity remains high. Trade agreements do not compensate for input asymmetry. Buyers optimize for price and reliability, not for historical partnership. Germany's alignment within open trade frameworks exposes it to substitution without protection. Market access is preserved, but preference is not. Labor alignment introduces another layer of rigidity. Workforce specialization evolved under assumptions of stable industrial geography and long production horizons. Skills are deep, but narrow. Mobility exists, but retraining at scale is slow. When industries contract or relocate, labor cannot redeploy without loss of productivity or social friction. The system protects employment through support mechanisms, but protection delays reallocation. Stability is maintained at the cost of adaptation speed. Policy alignment constrains response options. Fiscal and regulatory tools operate within negotiated boundaries that prioritize predictability and compliance. Emergency interventions are possible, but they are designed to bridge disruptions, not to rewrite structural dependencies. Measures that could restore control through rapid reconfiguration often conflict with long-established frameworks. As a result, responses focus on cushioning impact rather than altering architecture. The system absorbs pressure instead of releasing it. The alignment problem is not miscalculation. It is consistency. Germany's system behaves coherently with the structures it inhabits. Each component acts rationally within its domain. Together, they produce inertia. Awareness of dependency does not automatically generate autonomy. Time, 0.5s. In fact, the more integrated a system becomes, the harder it is to pivot without collective rupture. This is the defining tension of the modern phase. Germany recognizes the constraint, but operates within arrangements that diffuse the authority required to resolve it quickly. The system remains functional, yet bounded. Output continues, yet under conditions set elsewhere. Alignment that once amplified strength now limits maneuverability. In historical terms, this is the moment when empires confront the limits of coordination without control. The system has not collapsed. It has synchronized itself into a configuration where adjustment is possible only slowly and at cost. What follows depends not on intent, but on how pressure accumulates relative to the system's capacity to absorb it. Acceleration occurs when constraint interacts with time. Germany's system does not deteriorate simply because energy is expensive or scarce. It accelerates when delayed decisions compound. Each year of constrained margins reduces discretionary investment. Each postponed upgrade narrows future options. What appears manageable in isolation becomes destabilizing in sequence. The system enters a zone where pressure no longer accumulates linearly, but multiplicatively. The trigger zone is defined by inflexibility. Once critical industries operate close to even minor disruptions propagate quickly. Maintenance schedules shorten. Supplier reliability declines. Insurance and financing costs rise. These effects reinforce one another. A temporary shock no longer dissipates. It cascades. The system's tolerance for error collapses before output does. Germany approaches this zone not because it lacks capacity, but because its capacity is calibrated too tightly to absorb variance. Acceleration is also temporal. Policy responses require consensus, design, and implementatio. Time, that's zero point 0.5s. Industrial responses require capital, permitting, and construction. Market responses occur immediately. Price signals adjust faster than infrastructure. Contracts reset faster than strategy. When timelines diverge this sharply, reaction replaces planning. Decisions become defensive. Long-term commitments are deferred precisely when they are most needed. The system begins consuming optionality faster than it can generate it. External triggers need not be dramatic. They can be incremental. A regulatory shift that marginally raises costs. A trade realignment that slightly alters demand. A financing reassessment that delays a single project. In isolation, these events are absorbable. Within the trigger zone, they interact. Margins compress further. Confidence erodes. Investment pauses propagate. Acceleration emerges not from shock size, but from system state. At this stage, intervention faces diminishing returns. Subsidies preserve operations but distort signals. Price caps delay adjustment but transfer stress elsewhere. Strategic reserves buy time but do not restore control. Each measure reduces immediate strain while increasing future rigidity. The system remains active, but increasingly reactive. Germany's industrial core continues to function, yet its trajectory becomes path-constrained. The defining feature of the trigger zone is irreversibility. Once key decisions are deferred beyond certain thresholds, recovery requires accepting losses rather than avoiding them. Capacity exits quietly. Supply chains reconfigure elsewhere. Skills disperse. These changes do not announce themselves as crisis. They appear as rational responses to uncertainty. Acceleration completes when adaptation becomes more costly than withdrawal. This is not the end of the system. It is the point where outcomes become shaped by momentum rather than choice. Germany enters this phase not through collapse, but through compression of time and options. When acceleration takes hold, stability no longer signals safety. It signals proximity to transition. The consequences of this pattern do not distribute evenly. They concentrate where dependence meets exposure. Energy-intensive industries bear the first losses, not because they are inefficient, but because they are most tightly coupled to the constrained input. Chemical production, heavy manufacturing, and advanced materials absorb cost increases that cannot be passed through without sacrificing market position. These sectors do not disappear immediately. They contract selectively. Capacity utilization declines. Investment horizons shorten. Strategic decisions shift from expansion to preservation. Downstream effects follow. Supplier networks thin as anchor firms delay orders or renegotiate terms. Smaller producers lack the balance sheet resilience to absorb prolonged uncertainty. They exit quietly or consolidate under less favorable conditions. Regional economies built around dense industrial clusters experience gradual erosion rather than shock. Employment is protected in the short term through support mechanisms, but opportunity drains as new projects fail to materialize. The system maintains social stability while hollowing future potential. Exposure extends beyond industry. Fiscal capacity is tested as intervention replaces advantage. Public resources compensate for structural cost asymmetry rather than financing growth. This trade-off is sustainable for a time, but it alters the role of the state from enabler to stabilizer. Once that shift occurs, policy flexibility narrows. Each commitment reduces room for the next response. The burden accumulates invisibly. Internationally, perception adjusts faster than reality. Germany remains a major economy, but expectations recalibrate. Partners adapt supply chains. Investors reassess risk premiums. None of these moves signal collapse. They signal repricing. Influence declines not through confrontation, but through substitution. Control over outcomes diminishes even as formal position remains. The exposure phase is often misunderstood because it lacks drama. There is no singular event, no visible failure. What changes is the direction of adaptation. The system adapts outward, not inward. It yields ground rather than reshaping itself. That choice is rarely explicit. It emerges from accumulated constraints. This is where historical patterns converge. Systems rarely fail when weakness is obvious. They fail when strength persists inside boundaries that steadily tighten. Germany's trajectory illustrates this dynamic with clarity. The cost is not immediate collapse. It is the gradual transfer of agency away from the system itself. The pattern does not end in catastrophe. It ends in redefinition. Germany's experience demonstrates how industrial power can persist while autonomy erodes. The system does not collapse because it fails. It contracts because it functions too efficiently within constraints it does not control. Energy dependence is not the cause, but the lens through which structural limits become visible. What matters is not whether recovery is possible, but what must be surrendered to achieve it. History shows that timing rarely determines outcomes. Sequence does. When efficiency precedes resilience, strength becomes conditional. And once conditions are set externally, power survives only within boundaries it did not choose.